So now that I got a sense of how Cinema 4D works and I've had some time playing around with the interface, let's get started by working on our first project, and we'll try to design a snowman scene. I have an example here posted in Blackboard, and in order to get this project started, I'm going to go out and I've already created a class folder. And inside that class folder, I'm going to create a project file. Now it's really important that any project that you work on in Cinema 4D has its own project folder, because there's going to be a lot of different assets that go into the creation of these projects. So it's really important that we keep all of those assets together. So I'm going to be working from an external drive this semester, and I've set up a class folder, and inside my class folder is my project folder, and this will be kind of a standard procedure for each project. So every project that you start, you should have a project folder before you get started in Cinema 4D. So now I'll jump into Cinema 4D, and before I even start creating anything, the first thing I'm going to do is do a quick file save as. And I'll establish the project file in its appropriate location. So I'll navigate out to my desktop or my system finder, and I'll find my external hard drive, and from there I'll go into my class folder, into my project folder. Now this project, I'm going to put my name on the front end, first name, last initial. I'll add an underscore, and then I'll name the project Snowman. And at the end of the project name, I'll include 01, and I'll preserve the .c4d file extension. So I have my first name and initial here, underscore the project, and then I have 01. 01 is going to be the version of the file that I'm working on, and as I make progress on this project, I'll continue to save, and I'll do a save as, and I'll increment this to bump up the file name so that I build a history into my workflow. This way, in the event that I corrupt a file or I damage a file, or I completely delete some stuff that I wanted to and I didn't realize, and I save over top of the file, or maybe I inadvertently overwrite a file or I lose a file, I have a history built into my workflow process. And so instead of working on one file for an entire week, maybe I'll a couple times a day just make sure that I do a save as, increment that file name. This way, if something happens to that file that I'm working on, I don't lose an entire week of my life. Maybe at worst I'll lose, half a day or a couple of hours or something like that. So I'm gonna hit the save button, and now I can get to the task of starting to create my basic snowman scene. Now the easiest thing to model in the snowman is going to be the body, and I'll get started with that by generating a sphere. Now, I'm not so concerned what the actual size of the sphere is, because I'm going to model things relative. So, I have a 100 centimeter sphere here. That roughly translates to about 3 feet. So this is going to be a pretty huge snowman if I'm going by the measurements, but I'm going to let this default. I think that's a good starting size. Now, I haven't moved this sphere at all, and I'm going to keep that right at its origin, or the place where it was created. And I'm going to generate another sphere. I'll just jump back into the parametric primitive menu, and I'll choose sphere. And it doesn't look like anything happened on screen, but if you remember from the previous presentation, anytime we generate content, that content shows up in the same coordinates. 0, 0, 0, according to the X, Y, and Z. And you can see in the Object Manager I have a second instance of the sphere. By default, the object that I just created was already selected, and what I'll do is I'll just move that up a little bit. And once I start to move it up, right off the bat, it's way too big. And so what I'll do is I'll just take the radius value that I can find in the Attributes Manager of the sphere, and I'll just key in a value, and I'll start off with maybe 75. That still feels a little big, so I'll take it down to 70. I'm not so concerned about the exact proportion at this point. I want to rough it in because I can always go back and continue to edit this. Now I'm going to continue to lift that sphere up, and I'm paying special attention to how these spheres start to interact. And remember, I can flatten out my view to get a better sense of this, but I think that that's pretty good. So at this point, I have the two bottom pieces of my snowman built. Now for the head, instead of generating a new sphere, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to borrow sphere 1, and I'll choose to edit copy, edit paste. And what I get is I get a copy, an exact duplicate of the object that I copied and pasted, and it pastes at the same coordinates. So I'll just take that object and I'll move it up. I'll do the same thing I did before, which I'll make it smaller, and I'll just key in a new set of values. So I'm holding down the 1 key to pan up, and I'll move this head up to see if that's about the size that I want. I think that the proportion feels pretty good. Maybe the head feels a little big. I'm going to pay less attention to what the actual radius size is and pay more attention to visually what it looks like here. And I'll just bump this down a little bit, and I'm pretty satisfied with that. So with a few quick clicks of the mouse, I got the rough snowman body together. Now, when I look at the object manager, you see I have sphere 1, sphere 2, and sphere. Probably not the best naming convention, so what I'll do is I'll go back in, I'll select the bottom sphere, and I'll simply call that bottom sphere bottom. I'll double click on the name of sphere 1, and I'll call this middle, and I'll double click on the title of sphere 2, and I'll call this top or head. Now, once I get all 3 of those renamed, it makes sense to me that these 3 objects should be grouped together because this will be the snowman body, and Cinema 4D allows us to group objects together. And we can do this by making a selection. We can select all 3 objects, and we can select those objects a couple of different ways. We can select the objects in the viewport by clicking on them and holding down shift click and continuing to select all the objects. Alternatively, if I click and drag inside my object manager, you can see that I get this temporary marquee. And if I drag across all 3 of those objects, you can see that those are now highlighted and selected. I can go to the object menu and choose to group objects. Alternatively, I can hold down the Option key on the keyboard and press G. So Option G will group these objects together. Now, once we group those objects, if you look in the object manager, you can see that now we end up with this null object. A null object is just a container object. This is just now the collective group of objects, and if I click on the little plus sign, you can see that it reveals the hierarchy, and it just shows that parented in the null object are top, middle, and bottom spheres. And so I'll just rename the null object. That didn't seem like an appropriate name, and I'll just call this body. I can collapse the hierarchy, and now when I select the body object, if I wanted to, I could move that object around. Alternatively, if I go into the group object, I can still select the individual objects and move them independently of the parent object. So that's just a real quick rough out of the snowman body. Now, the important thing, the entire time I moved these objects around, it was really important that I was only moving those objects up according to the y-axis. Now, if you didn't move the objects up, and maybe you moved them along X or Z, you can tell, if I go back into my group, my body group, if I select the top object and I go and look at the position coordinates, I can see that everything is 0 with the exception of Y. So this sphere is 119 centimeters up on the y-axis, and that's just about what I want. I'll go into the middle axis, and I can see here that the only value that changes, everything's set to 0 except for the y value. And then, of course, when I get to the bottom, everything's set to 0 with the exception of the y-axis. So make sure you do a quick audit of all of your shapes, and as you select them, make sure that the only value that is changing is the y value. Now, in the event that you are creating these objects and you're clicking and dragging on something other than the axes, you can see here that as I move this around, I'm not restricting its motion. And even though I can line it up and it looks pretty good from a straight on, and I'll just do the same thing with the head. So again, I'm making a mistake on purpose. I'm not restricting its motion to one axis, and I'll just click and move this around and say, oh, that's wrong. Let me just move this back, and oh, that looks pretty good. It looks perfect, doesn't it? Well, I can tell right now that if I look with the top object selected and I look at the X, Y, and Z values, I can see that they're all over the place. And it may not be so obvious now, but watch what happens when we start to orbit. I'll make a more dramatic example of this. Let's see. There we go. That looks pretty good. Now watch what happens when we orbit. You can see how that head is starting to fall off to the side. Same thing here. I'll be really dramatic about this. So we can get this to line up here. that doesn't look too bad. So I'm just, kind of clicking and moving these things around, and it looks okay through the viewport. It looks a little weird down here. And then as soon as I start to orbit, you can see things that completely fall apart. So it's really important that we're moving objects and restricting their motion to only one axis at a time, and that we're not lining things up directly through the perspective viewport the way that we think that they should look. We should be very specific about the direction that we're moving things. So I'll just hold down Command Z and tap that a few times to get things right back where they should be, and I'm pretty satisfied that that's it. And I'll click through these objects, and I can see that actually my top object was out of whack, so I just Command Z, same thing with the middle. I'll just undo until that all snaps back into shape. I think that's pretty good. So in the next presentation, we'll push this forward and we'll start to add some details to the snowman. In the event that you're moving objects all over the place and you're knocking them out of line, you can test that, again, simply by clicking on these objects and just doing a quick audit of their position coordinates. As you orbit around, some things will be obvious if you're moving things according to 3 axes, and that's a really important point. I can't stress that enough, that this early stage of 3D modeling, make sure that you're intentionally moving objects just according to the axis that you want to move them. The next presentation we'll push forward and we'll start to decorate our snowman, and we'll do that in the next presentation.